In the winter of 1887, a single photograph arrived at the Charleston courthouse that would haunt investigators for decades. It showed 17 children, ages 3 to 16, standing barefoot in the snow outside a ramshackle cabin in the remote hollows of West Virginia. What made this image disturbing wasn't just their skeletal frames or hollow eyes. It was the iron shackles visible around their ankles and the fact that, according to official records, the Greylock family of Bone Creek Hollow had reported only 4 children living in their home. The remaining 13 had been systematically erased from all documentation, their births never recorded, their existence denied by every adult in the isolated mountain community. Before we continue with the story of the Greylock family and their unspeakable crimes hidden deep in the Appalachian wilderness, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the darkest true stories that history tried to bury, and tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Let's see how far these forgotten American horror stories reach. The photograph that started it all was just the beginning of a mystery that would expose one of the most systematic cases of child exploitation in American history. Buried beneath generations of mountain silence and complicity, Bone Creek Hollow carved itself deep into the West Virginia mountains like a scar that never healed. In 1887, this remote valley existed in a world unto itself, cut off from civilization by treacherous mountain passes that became impossible during the brutal Appalachian winters. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 27 miles through winding deer paths that could swallow a man whole if he didn't know the mountain secrets. Here in this forgotten pocket of America, families had lived by their own rules for generations, bound by blood, silence, and an unspoken understanding that what happened in the hollow stayed in the hollow. The Greylock family had claimed the valley's most fertile bottomland in 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock led his wife and 6 children through the Cumberland Gap during the Great Westward Migration. Unlike other families who sought fortune in gold or fertile plains, Jeremiah Greylock had different ambitions. He understood that isolation bred opportunity for those willing to operate outside society's watchful eye. The hollow provided everything he needed: fresh water from Bone Creek, rich soil for crops, dense forests for hunting, and most importantly, complete separation from government interference, church oversight, or curious neighbors. By 1887, 3 generations of Greylocks had transformed their mountain retreat into something far more complex than a simple homestead. Ezekiel Greylock, Jeremiah's grandson, controlled not just his own family, but an intricate network of relatives, hired hands, and what local records euphemistically called wards. Children whose origins nobody questioned and whose welfare nobody monitored. The hollow had become a self-contained world where Ezekiel's word was law, his justice absolute, and his methods of maintaining order both creative and terrifying. Ezekiel himself was a man shaped by the harsh mountain environment. Tall and lean as a hickory sapling, with eyes the color of winter ice, he possessed an intelligence that many underestimated due to his backwards dialect and patched clothing. But behind that carefully cultivated rustic facade was a calculating mind that had spent decades perfecting a system of control that would have impressed the most ruthless plantation overseer. His wife, Martha Greylock, born Martha Kellerman from a neighboring hollow, had been shaped by 30 years of mountain isolation into something as hard and unforgiving as the stone peaks that surrounded their home. The Greylock children, at least the 4 officially recognized ones, reflected their parents' harsh philosophy. Samuel, the eldest at 19, had inherited his father's cold intelligence and cruel creativity. Rebecca, 17, possessed a quiet viciousness that manifested in small acts of calculated cruelty. The younger twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, barely 14, had already learned that survival in their family meant absolute obedience to their father's increasingly bizarre demands and complete silence about what they witnessed in their isolated world. But these 4 represented only the visible tip of a much larger and more disturbing reality. The Greylock family's true power came from their ability to acquire and control children whose disappearances would never be investigated, whose screams would never be heard beyond the mountain walls, and whose labor would never be compensated. In an era when child mortality rates were high, record-keeping was sporadic, and communication between remote communities was nearly non-existent, The Greylocks had discovered they could operate their own private kingdom with complete impunity. The method of acquisition was both simple and diabolical. During harsh winters, desperate families from surrounding hollows would sometimes approach Ezekiel with offers to bind out their children, a common practice where families struggling to survive would send children to work for better established households in exchange for food, shelter, and supposed education. However, once these children crossed the threshold into Bone Creek Hollow, they entered a world where legal protections meant nothing, where their original families were told they had moved on to opportunities in the big towns, and where their new reality was closer to slavery than apprenticeship. Other children arrived through even darker channels: orphans from failed homesteads, abandoned infants left at remote churches, children whose parents had died in mining accidents or from the diseases that regularly swept through Appalachian communities. All found their way to the Greylock family through a network of corrupt county officials, unscrupulous traveling preachers, and opportunistic neighbors who received small payments for their silence and cooperation. By winter of 1887, this system had been operating successfully for over 2 decades. The official Greylock household consisted of 6 people, but the reality was a carefully orchestrated community of 21 souls, 17 of whom existed in a shadow world of backbreaking labor, inadequate food, and systematic brutality that would have shocked even the most hardened observers of that harsh era. The photograph that would eventually expose the Greylock family's crimes was never intended to serve as evidence. In December 1887, a traveling photographer named Henry Peaton had been making his way through the mountain communities, offering to capture family portraits for the unusually reasonable price of 50 cents per sitting. For isolated families who might never see another photographer, this represented a precious opportunity to document their lives for posterity. Peon had heard about the Greylocks during his stay in Cedar Ridge. Local merchants spoke of the family with a mixture of respect and weariness, describing Ezekiel as a man who always paid his debts in cash and who seemed to produce an unusual amount of crops and preserved goods for trade despite the harsh conditions of his isolated hollow. Intrigued by stories of the family's prosperity and hoping for a substantial commission, Peaton had made the difficult journey to Bone Creek Hollow on the 15th of December, 1887. What he found there challenged every assumption he had made about backwoods mountain families. The Greylock homestead was not the rough log cabin he had expected, but a complex of well-constructed buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main house, built from expertly hunned chestnut logs, featured multiple rooms, glass windows, and a stone chimney that spoke of permanent prosperity. Surrounding it were a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, workshops for various crafts, and what appeared to be dormitory-style structures that seemed oddly institutional for a family dwelling. But it was the children that first struck Peaton as unusual. When he arrived, Ezekiel had proudly introduced his 4 official children, each dressed in clean, well-maintained clothing, and displaying the kind of respectful demeanor that spoke of strict discipline. However, as Peaton set up his equipment in the central courtyard, he began to notice other children moving in the shadows between buildings, thin figures who seemed to melt away whenever he looked directly at them. Children whose clothing was patched and worn, whose movements carried a furtive quality that spoke of constant vigilance. When Pemberton mentioned these other children to Ezekiel, the mountain patriarch's explanation was smooth and reasonable. They were hired hands, children, orphans the family had taken in out of Christian charity, distant relatives who helped with the seasonal work. All perfectly normal for a large homestead in the remote mountains where extended family networks and informal adoptions were common survival strategies. But as Peaton prepared to take the family portrait, something happened that shattered the carefully maintained facade. A commotion erupted from one of the outlying buildings. The sound of running feet, shouting voices, and what sounded distinctly like chains rattling. Several of the shadow children suddenly burst into the courtyard, and for the first time Peaton got a clear look at them. These were not the healthy, well-fed relatives or hired hands children that Ezekiel had described. These were skeletal figures with hollow eyes wearing patched clothing that hung from their frames like burial shrouds, and around their ankles, clearly visible in the winter sunlight, were iron shackles connected by short lengths of chain that allowed them to walk but prevented any possibility of running. The scene that followed burned itself into Peaton's memory with photographic clarity. Martha Greylock screamed at the children in a voice that carried decades of practiced cruelty. Samuel and Rebecca moved with swift efficiency to round up the escapees, wielding leather straps with the casual expertise of long practice. Ezekiel's mask of civilized hospitality slipped away entirely, revealing something cold and calculating as he began issuing rapid orders about securing the workers and maintaining discipline. In that moment of chaos and revealed truth, Piton's professional instincts overcame his shock. His camera was already prepared for the family portrait, and almost without conscious thought, he triggered the shutter. The resulting image captured 17 children standing in the snow outside the main house, their shackles clearly visible, their faces bearing expressions of hopelessness and terror that no amount of time could erase from his memory. The aftermath was swift and terrifying. Ezekiel immediately realized what had happened and demanded the photographic plate, but Piton, sensing that he had documented something of terrible importance, claimed the exposure had failed and that he would need to prepare a new plate. This bought him precious time to secretly prepare a second plate with the incriminating image while pretending to set up for a retake. When he finally produced a successful family portrait showing only the 4 official Greylock children arranged in conventional poses, Ezekiel seemed satisfied that the evidence of his crimes had been contained. Piton left Bone Creek Hollow that evening, carrying 2 photographic plates, one showing the respectable Greylock family as they wanted to be remembered, and another showing a truth so horrifying that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The photographer's hands shook as he developed the plates in his hotel room in Cedar Ridge 3 days later. The image of those 17 shackled children seemed to stare back at him from the photographic paper, their silent suffering demanding justice that he was not sure how to provide. In an era when photography was still regarded with suspicion in many rural areas, when legal protections for children were minimal, and when the word of respectable white landowners carried enormous weight against the testimony of an outsider, Piton faced a terrible choice: remain silent and live with his conscience, or risk everything to expose crimes that most people would find easier to disbelieve than confront. Henry Petton's decision to act on what he had witnessed in Bone Creek Hollow was neither immediate nor simple. For 3 weeks after his return to Charleston, the photographer found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had discovered and the potential consequences of exposing it. The photograph sat in his studio safe, its existence known only to him, while he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. In 1888, West Virginia, the legal system was not equipped to handle crimes of this nature, particularly when they involved established landowners in remote areas. Child labor was common and largely unregulated. Informal adoptions and apprenticeships were normal practices. The line between harsh discipline and criminal abuse was often a matter of local custom rather than legal statute. More troubling still, Piton had begun to understand, through careful inquiries, that the Greylock family's influence extended far beyond their isolated hollow. When he finally approached local authorities in Charleston, his reception was mixed and frustrating. The county sheriff, James Rutland, listened to Piton's account with skeptical attention, but pointed out the practical difficulties of investigating claims against a family living in such remote terrain. More concerning was Rutledge's obvious familiarity with Ezekiel Greylock's name and his reluctance to discuss details of that familiarity. When pressed, the sheriff finally admitted that Greylock had been helpful to law enforcement on several occasions and was regarded as a reliable source of information about criminal activity in the mountain regions. This revelation opened up disturbing new questions about the scope of the Greylock operation. Through patient investigation over the following months, Piton began to uncover a network of relationships that suggested the crimes in Bone Creek Hollow were part of a much larger system of corruption and exploitation. Court records from surrounding counties revealed that Ezekiel Greylock had been involved in dozens of child placement arrangements over the past 15 years. He regularly appeared before judges to formalize the adoption or apprenticeship of orphaned children, always with proper documentation and apparently legitimate arrangements for their care and education. However, when Piton attempted to track down some of these children, he discovered a disturbing pattern. They had simply vanished from all official records after their placement with the Greylock family. More troubling still was the discovery that several county officials, including 2 judges and a court clerk, had received substantial loans from Ezekiel Greylock during financial difficulties. These debts created relationships of dependence that effectively ensured the family's operations would never face serious legal scrutiny. The Mountain Patriarch had constructed a system of mutually beneficial corruption that protected his activities while providing valuable services to local authorities who preferred to have difficult social problems handled quietly, efficiently. The scope of complicity extended beyond government officials. Local churches, which might have been expected to show concern for child welfare, had received generous donations from the Greylock family. Several ministers had actually helped facilitate child placements, convinced they were serving Christian charity by finding homes for orphans and troubled youth. The family's reputation for hard work, financial stability, and religious devotion made them ideal candidates for handling society's unwanted children. Even more chilling was Peaton's discovery that the Greylock system had been operating for decades. Older residents of surrounding communities, when approached carefully, would sometimes admit to knowing families who had sent children to work for the Greylocks during desperate times. However, these same residents would invariably claim that the arrangements had worked out well, that the children had eventually moved on to good positions in distant towns, and that the Greylock family deserved credit for their charitable assistance to struggling neighbors. The photographer began to understand that he was confronting not just individual criminals, but an entire social system that had evolved to handle uncomfortable truths by making them invisible. The children in his photograph existed in a carefully constructed blind spot where society's protective mechanisms simply did not function. As Peaton delved deeper into the historical background, he uncovered evidence suggesting that the current generation of Greylocks had inherited and perfected techniques developed by their predecessors. Jeremiah Greylock, the family patriarch who had first settled Bone Creek Hollow and arrived in West Virginia with an unusually large number of children who were described in early records as bound servants and apprentices. Census records from the 1842nd and 1852nd showed fluctuating numbers of children in the Greylock household, with some appearing and disappearing from official counts in ways that suggested a system already in operation. More disturbing still were fragmentary records from neighboring families that hinted at the fate of children who had proven troublesome or unsuitable for the Greylocks' purposes. Several families reported children who had run off to seek their fortunes after brief stays with the Mountain family, but these disappearances followed suspicious patterns. They typically occurred during harsh weather when travel would be nearly impossible, and the missing children invariably left behind all their possessions, including items of sentimental value that seemed unlikely to be abandoned voluntarily. The mountain terrain around Bone Creek Hollow provided ample opportunities for permanent disposal of inconvenient evidence. The area was riddled with deep caves, abandoned mine shafts, and remote gorges where a body might never be found. Local hunters and trappers occasionally reported finding unusual bone fragments or scraps of clothing in remote areas, but these discoveries were typically attributed to animal predation or natural accidents rather than investigated as potential evidence of foul play. By autumn of 1888, Peaton had assembled a body of evidence that painted a horrifying picture of systematic child exploitation stretching back over 50 years. The photograph that had started his investigation was merely the most recent documentation of crimes that had been hidden in plain sight for decades, protected by a conspiracy of silence, complicity, and willful ignorance that encompassed multiple counties and generations of officials. But evidence alone was not enough to ensure justice. The photographer now faced the challenge of finding authorities both capable and willing to act against a criminal enterprise that had successfully operated with impunity for half a century. The breakthrough in Peaton's investigation came from an unexpected source. A former resident of Bone Creek Hollow who had managed to escape the Greylock family's control and build a new life in Ohio. In late 1888, word of the photographer's inquiries had spread through the informal networks that connected mountain communities across the region, eventually reaching Sarah Kellerman, a woman living in Cincinnati, under the assumed name Sarah Miller. Sarah had been born in 1851 as the youngest daughter of the Kellerman family, neighbors of the Greylocks in the early days of settlement. When her parents died of typhoid fever in 1863, 2-year-old Sarah and her 2 younger brothers had been placed in Ezekiel Greylock's care through what appeared to be a legitimate guardianship arrangement. What she experienced during the following 6 years in Bone Creek Hollow had shaped every day of her life since her escape in 1869. When Piton finally met with Sarah in December 1888, he encountered a woman whose testimony would transform his understanding of the true scope of the Greylock crimes. Sarah's account revealed that the shackled children in his photograph represented only one component of a much larger and more systematic operation that combined child labor, deliberate malnutrition, psychological torture, and something approaching organized breeding of human beings for exploitation. According to Sarah's testimony, the Greylock family had developed their system over decades of experimentation with different methods of control and exploitation. The iron shackles were reserved for children who had attempted escape or shown signs of rebellion. Most of the workers in the hollow were controlled through more subtle means: deliberate malnutrition that left them too weak to travel long distances, psychological manipulation that convinced them they were worthless and unwanted by the outside world, and a carefully maintained system of rewards and punishments that kept them competing with each other rather than cooperating against their oppressors. The physical layout of the Greylock compound reflected this sophisticated approach to human control. What Piton had assumed were dormitory buildings were actually carefully designed prison structures disguised as normal farm buildings. The main sleeping quarters for the bound children were windowless structures with heavy doors that could be barred from the outside. Sleeping arrangements deliberately separated siblings and friends to prevent the formation of relationships that might lead to coordinated resistance. Food distribution was used as both a control mechanism and a method of deliberate weakening. The bound children received carefully calculated rations designed to maintain their ability to work while keeping them too malnourished to attempt escape across the difficult mountain terrain. Sarah described a constant state of hunger so severe that children would fight each other for scraps, creating an environment where cooperation became impossible and survival depended on individual submission to the Greylock's demands. But perhaps most disturbing was Sarah's revelation about the family's long-term planning. The Greylocks did not simply exploit children until they became too old to control. They had developed a systematic breeding program designed to produce successive generations of workers who would never know any life outside the hollow. Teenage girls among the bound children were regularly forced into sexual relationships with older boys or young men, with any resulting children becoming the property of the Greylock family from birth. These second-generation captives who had never known freedom or contact with the outside world were reportedly the most valuable workers in the Greylock system, having no memory of life beyond the hollow. No knowledge of legal protections or normal social relationships. They were perfectly adapted to their roles as permanent servants. Some had been deliberately kept illiterate and ignorant of basic facts about the outside world, making them psychologically incapable of conceiving escape, even if physical opportunities arose. Sarah's own escape had been possible only because of her age at the time of her placement with the family. She retained enough memories of normal life to recognize the abnormality of her situation and enough education to understand that alternatives existed. Her flight from the hollow in 1869 had been carefully planned over months, requiring her to secretly accumulate food, study the mountain paths, and time her escape to coincide with a severe winter storm that would make pursuit difficult. Even more chilling was Sarah's description of what happened to children who proved unsuitable for the Greylock system. Those who were too sickly to work, too rebellious to control, or simply surplus to the family's labor needs did not simply disappear. They were systematically murdered in ways designed to serve as lessons to the surviving children. Sarah had witnessed several such executions during her time in the hollow, including the drowning of her younger brother, Thomas, who had been caught attempting to signal a passing traveler for help. The methods used were deliberately theatrical and educational. Children were forced to watch as their companions were beaten to death, strangled, or thrown into the icy waters of Bone Creek during winter months, when the bodies would be trapped under ice until spring floods carried them far downstream. These public executions served multiple purposes. They eliminated troublesome individuals, terrorized the surviving population into complete compliance, and provided practical lessons in the consequences of resistance. Sarah's testimony also revealed the broader economic scope of the Greylock operation. The family's apparent prosperity was built not just on unpaid labor, but on a sophisticated network of criminal activities that included theft, fraud, and what would now be recognized as human trafficking. Children with particular skills or physical attributes were sometimes sold to other criminal enterprises in distant states, generating substantial cash income that helped fund the family's expansion and corruption of local officials. The Mountain family had also perfected techniques for acquiring property and resources through systematic fraud. They would identify vulnerable families facing financial difficulties, offer assistance in the form of loans or crop-sharing arrangements, then gradually manipulate these relationships to acquire land, livestock, and eventually children. Over 50 years of such activities had made them one of the wealthiest families in the region, while maintaining the appearance of simple mountain farmers. Most troubling of all was Sarah's revelation about the Greylock family's connections to similar operations in other remote areas. During her captivity, she had encountered children who spoke of other families, other hollows, other places where the same systems of exploitation were operating under different names, but following identical patterns. The implication was that the Bone Creek Hollow operation was not unique, but part of a broader network of organized child exploitation that stretched across the Appalachian region. As winter deepened in 1888, Peton found himself in possession of evidence that suggested one of the most systematic cases of organized child abuse in American history. But he also understood that the very scope and duration of the crimes made them almost impossible to prosecute through normal legal channels. Too many officials were compromised, too many years had passed, and too many powerful interests depended on maintaining the silence that had protected these activities for decades. Armed with Sarah Kellerman's devastating testimony, Peton spent the early months of 1889 attempting to build a case that could survive the political pressures and legal obstacles protecting the Greylock family. However, his efforts to gather additional witnesses and evidence soon revealed that Sarah's escape had been neither as clean nor as final as she had believed. In February 1889, Sarah received a letter at her Cincinnati home that turned her blood to ice. Written in the careful script of someone with limited education but considerable cunning, it read simply, "We know where you are, Sarah Kellerman. We know about your husband, Charles Miller, and your daughter, Emma. Mountain justice has a long memory, and family debts are never forgotten. Some secret should stay buried in the hollow where they belong." The letter was signed with a crude drawing of a Greylock flower, the mountain laurel that gave the family its name. The discovery that the Greylock family had tracked Sarah to her new life in Ohio revealed a level of organization and reach that neither she nor Peton had previously understood. More disturbing still was the implication that other former captives might have been located and either silenced or brought back to the hollow through threats against family members they had acquired since their escapes. Peton immediately arranged for Sarah and her family to be moved to a safe location while he attempted to understand how the Greylocks had traced her. The answer came through his investigation of marriage and birth records in Ohio, which revealed that several government clerks had received inquiries about Sarah Kellerman, also known as Sarah Miller, from what were described as family members seeking reunion. These inquiries had been accompanied by small payments for information and had successfully identified Sarah's current name, address, and family situation. This revelation forced Peton to confront the possibility that his own investigation had somehow been compromised. If the Greylock family possessed the resources and connections to track former captives across state lines, they likely also had the capability to monitor efforts to expose their activities. The photographer began to suspect that his questions in Charleston and surrounding areas had been reported back to Bone Creek Hollow, putting both himself and his sources in immediate danger. His fears were confirmed when he returned to his Charleston studio in March to find evidence of careful but thorough searching. Nothing appeared to be missing, but items had been subtly moved, files had been examined, and his safe had been opened, despite showing no signs of forced entry. Most chilling of all, a single Greylock flower had been left on his desk, its white petals already turning brown in the warm indoor air, a message that was both threat and promise. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Bone Creek Hollow intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The escalation of threats coincided with disturbing reports from the mountains themselves. Travelers passing through areas near Bone Creek Hollow reported unusual activities. Large groups of men moving through the forest at night, the sound of construction work coming from the remote valley, and an increase in the number of armed guards seen patrolling the approaches to the Greylock property. Local merchants noted that the family's purchases had shifted toward items suggesting preparation for a siege. Large quantities of preserved food, ammunition, medical supplies, and building materials suitable for fortification. More ominously, several people who had provided information to Peaton's investigation began experiencing their own forms of intimidation. A former county clerk, who had admitted to accepting payments from the Greylock family, found his barn destroyed by a mysterious fire. A merchant who had discussed the family's unusual purchasing patterns discovered his store had been burglarized with thieves, taking only his financial records and correspondence. A minister who had questioned the propriety of child placements with the Mountain family received visits from strangers who claimed to be conducting religious surveys, but asked pointed questions about his family and daily routines. The pattern of intimidation revealed that the Greylock family's influence extended far beyond what anyone had previously understood. They possessed not only the financial resources to corrupt officials and track fugitives across multiple states, but also the manpower to conduct simultaneous operations of surveillance, intimidation, and potential violence across a wide geographic area. Peaton's investigation had also attracted unwanted attention from federal authorities, but not in the way he had hoped. Rather than offering assistance in exposing the crimes, federal marshals seemed more interested in understanding why a photographer from Charleston was making inquiries that threatened to disrupt established law enforcement relationships in remote regions. When pressed for clarification, these officials made it clear that the Greylock family had been providing valuable intelligence about criminal activities in the mountains for years, and that disrupting this relationship could interfere with ongoing federal investigations of other criminal enterprises. The implication was both clear and terrifying. The Greylock family's systematic abuse of children was being protected because they served as informants for law enforcement agencies that valued their intelligence-gathering capabilities more than the lives of their victims. The federal government was not ignorant of the crimes in Bone Creek Hollow. They were complicit in allowing them to continue. As spring arrived in 1889, Peaton found himself trapped in a nightmare of expanding dimensions. His attempts to expose one family's crimes had revealed a network of corruption, complicity, and organized cruelty that reached into every level of government and law enforcement. The photograph that had started his investigation was no longer simply evidence of child abuse. It was documentation of systematic failures by American institutions that had allowed such horrors to flourish under official protection. But the most terrifying development was yet to come. In April 1889, Peaton received word that 3 more children had disappeared from families in remote mountain communities, all under circumstances that suggested Greylock involvement. The family was not retreating in response to increased scrutiny. They were expanding their operations, confident that their network of protection would shield them from any consequences. The stakes of Peaton's investigation had escalated beyond justice, for past victims to preventing future atrocities. However, his evidence remained legally insufficient. His witnesses were terrified into silence, and his own safety was increasingly compromised. Time was running out, and the children of Appalachia continued to disappear into the hollow, where screams echoed only off mountain stone, and silence was enforced by iron shackles and the constant threat of death. The final confrontation began not with dramatic action, but with a single child's desperate gamble for freedom that would ultimately expose the full scope of the Greylock family's crimes. On the night of May 15th, 1889, a boy named Michael Brennan managed to escape from Bone Creek Hollow and made his way through 27 miles of treacherous mountain terrain to reach the town of Cedar Ridge. What made his escape remarkable was not just the distance traveled or the dangers overcome, but the fact that Michael had been born in the hollow as part of the Greylock family's breeding program and had never set foot outside the valley in his 14 years of life. Michael's arrival in Cedar Ridge created an immediate sensation and a crisis for the carefully maintained conspiracy of silence that had protected the Greylock operations. Unlike other escaped children who could be dismissed as runaways or troublemakers, Michael possessed detailed knowledge of the Hollow's layout, operations, and the fate of dozens of missing children dating back over a decade. More importantly, he carried physical evidence that could not be disputed or explained away. Detailed maps he had drawn of the compound's buildings, lists of names and ages of current captives, and most damning of all, a collection of small personal items taken from children who had died in the Hollow, items that could be matched to missing persons reports across multiple counties. When Michael stumbled into the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Office in the early morning hours, his appearance alone was enough to shatter any pretense of normalcy. His body bore the scars of systematic abuse, badly healed bone breaks, burn marks from disciplinary brandings, and malnutrition so severe that he appeared years younger than his actual age. But it was his psychological condition that proved most convincing to skeptical authorities. Michael possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of suffering, able to describe in clinical detail the various methods the Greylock family used to control, punish, and eliminate their captives. Sheriff Rutland, who had previously been reluctant to investigate claims against the Greylock family, found himself forced to act when Michael's testimony was corroborated by several pieces of evidence that could be independently verified. The boy's descriptions of specific missing children matched official reports with accuracy that would have been impossible unless he had actually known the victims. His maps of the Hollow corresponded exactly with surveying records from decades earlier, and his knowledge of the family's activities included details about their corruption of local officials that no outsider should have possessed. Most compelling of all was Michael's explanation of how he had acquired the information and evidence he carried. As one of the Hollow-born children, he had been trusted with greater freedom than captured outsiders and had been assigned to assist with record-keeping tasks that required basic literacy. Over years of careful observation and secret note-taking, he had assembled a comprehensive documentation of the Greylock operations, including detailed records of children who had died, been sold, or killed for disciplinary purposes. The boy's testimony revealed that the photograph Henry Peton had taken in 1887 had captured only a fraction of the truth. At the time of Michael's escape in 1889, the Hollow contained 47 children and young adults in various states of captivity, ranging from recently captured 6-year-olds to 2 0-year-old women who had spent their entire lives in bondage and were now being used to produce the next generation of captives. Michael's escape had been motivated by his discovery that the Greylock family was planning to eliminate their current population of captives and relocate their operations to a new location further west, where federal territories offered even less legal oversight than the established states. The decision to clean house had been prompted by increased scrutiny from Peton's investigation and concerns that too many people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the Hollow's activities. The planned massacre was to take place during the summer of 1889, with the deaths disguised as an outbreak of disease that would justify burning the bodies and destroying the evidence. The Greylock family had used similar tactics before when relocating their operations, but never on such a large scale. Michael had overheard Ezekiel discussing the logistics of killing 47 people efficiently while maintaining plausible deniability, and had realized that escape was the only alternative to witnessing the systematic murder of everyone he had ever known. Armed with Michael's testimony and evidence, Sheriff Rutland finally assembled a force capable of confronting the Greylock family directly. However, he discovered that organizing such an expedition required extreme secrecy, as the family's network of informants and corrupted officials extended throughout local law enforcement. The final raiding party consisted of federal marshals from outside the region, volunteer civilians with no connections to local government, and a handful of local lawmen whose loyalty could be trusted absolutely. The raid on Bone Creek Hollow took place on the 3rd of June, 1889, and what the authorities found there exceeded even Michael Brennan's devastating testimony. The Hollow had indeed been transformed into a sophisticated complex designed for the systematic exploitation of human beings, but the scope of the operations was far larger than anyone had imagined. In addition to the 47 current captives, investigators discovered evidence of hundreds of victims dating back to the family's arrival in the valley 55 years earlier. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Mass graves contained the remains of children who had died from abuse, malnutrition, or execution. Detailed records maintained by the family documented the acquisition, exploitation, and disposal of victims with the mechanical precision of a business ledger. Buildings throughout the compound contained implements of torture and restraint that demonstrated a level of sophisticated cruelty that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. But perhaps most horrifying was the discovery that the Greylock family's operations extended far beyond Bone Creek Hollow. Documents seized during the raid revealed correspondence with similar criminal enterprises across 7 states, suggesting a coordinated network of child exploitation that had been operating across Appalachia for decades. Letters detailed the sale and transfer of children between different families, the sharing of disciplinary techniques, and coordinated efforts to corrupt local officials and eliminate potential witnesses. The confrontation itself was both anticlimactic and terrifying. When the raiding party arrived at the Hollow, they found the Greylock family calmly waiting for them, as if they had been expecting the visit. Ezekiel Greylock, now in his 62nd, but still possessing the cold intelligence that had built his criminal empire, greeted the lawmen with polite courtesy and immediately began offering explanations for everything they would find. His strategy was sophisticated and nearly successful. Rather than denying the evidence, Ezekiel claimed that his family had been operating under official sanction from federal authorities who needed their remote location and questionable methods to handle special cases that normal institutions could not manage. He produced forged documents that appeared to authorize his activities as part of classified government programs and named specific federal officials who he claimed had approved and supervised his operations. The deception might have worked if not for Michael Brennan's presence with the raiding party. The boy's intimate knowledge of the Hollow's operations allowed him to guide investigators to evidence that contradicted Ezekiel's carefully prepared lies. More importantly, Michael's testimony about the planned massacre revealed that the Greylock family's apparent cooperation was simply another manipulation designed to buy time for the destruction of the most damning evidence. As investigators searched the compound, they discovered that several buildings had been prepared for rapid demolition, with barrels of lamp oil placed strategically to create fires that would consume records and physical evidence. More chilling still was the discovery that many of the current captives had been administered what appeared to be poison in their morning meal, suggesting that the family had planned to eliminate witnesses even while appearing to cooperate with authorities. The systematic poisoning was halted just in time to save most of the victims, but the incident revealed the true depths of the Greylock family's calculated cruelty. Even when facing certain exposure and punishment, they had prioritized the elimination of evidence over the preservation of human life. The casual efficiency with which they had prepared to murder dozens of children demonstrated that such acts were routine rather than desperate measures. The trials that followed the Bone Creek Hollow raid became one of the most significant criminal proceedings in West Virginia history, but the pursuit of justice proved almost as complex and disturbing as the crimes themselves. The scope of corruption revealed during the investigation forced authorities to confront the uncomfortable truth that the Greylock family's activities had been enabled by systematic failures at every level of government and society. Ezekiel Greylock and his immediate family members were ultimately convicted on charges ranging from kidnapping and murder to fraud and conspiracy. But their trials revealed that the network of complicity extended far beyond the Hollow itself. 12 county officials, 6 judges, and numerous law enforcement officers were implicated in covering up or directly facilitating the family's crimes. The resulting investigations and prosecutions lasted for over 3 years and effectively dismantled the existing power structure across 4 counties. The fate of the rescued children presented challenges that the legal system was ill-equipped to handle. Many of the captives, particularly those born in the Hollow, had no legal identity and no knowledge of life outside their captivity. Efforts to reunite children with their original families were largely unsuccessful, as most had been taken so young that they retained no memory of their previous lives, and their families had long since assumed them dead. More troubling still was the psychological damage inflicted by years of systematic abuse. The rescued children displayed behavioral patterns and trauma responses that contemporary medicine did not understand how to treat. Many were unable to adapt to normal social environments and required lifelong institutional care. Others simply disappeared back into the mountains, presumably returning to the only life they had ever known. Despite its horrors, Michael Brennan, whose courage had exposed the crimes and saved dozens of lives, became a symbol of both heroism and tragedy. While he was eventually able to build a new life in Pennsylvania, working as a teacher and advocate for child welfare reforms, he remained haunted by guilt over the victims he had been unable to save and the years of suffering he had witnessed in silence before his escape. Henry Peaton's photograph, which had started the entire investigation, was entered into evidence during the trials and became one of the most influential pieces of documentation in American legal history. The image of 17 shackled children standing in the snow forced the public to confront the reality that such systematic cruelty could exist in their own communities, hidden behind facades of respectability and protected by networks of corruption. The broader implications of the Bone Creek Hollow case extended far beyond the punishment of individual criminals. The investigation revealed that similar operations were likely functioning in remote areas across the country, protected by the same combination of isolation, corruption, and willful ignorance that had shielded the Greylock family for decades. Federal legislation was eventually passed, requiring better oversight of child placement agencies and stricter penalties for officials who failed to investigate reports of abuse. But enforcement remained inconsistent in remote rural areas. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that several children who had been sold or transferred to other criminal enterprises were never recovered. The Greylock family's records indicated that dozens of victims had been sent to locations across the Western Territories where they disappeared into other networks of exploitation that authorities were never able to trace. The true scope of their crimes may never be fully understood, as many victims simply vanished into the vast anonymity of America's frontier regions. The physical site of Bone Creek Hollow was abandoned after the trials, and nature gradually reclaimed the buildings where so much suffering had occurred. Local communities, traumatized by the revelation of what had been happening in their midst, preferred to forget rather than remember. The hollow became a place of silence once again, but now it was the silence of shame rather than complicity. Sarah Kellerman, whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, never fully recovered from the psychological impact of reliving her captivity through the legal proceedings. She spent her remaining years working with organizations dedicated to finding missing children. Driven by guilt over the victims she had left behind when she escaped and determination to prevent similar crimes from occurring elsewhere, her efforts contributed to the establishment of the first systematic missing persons databases in American law enforcement. The Greylock case forced American society to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of isolation and the dangers of unquestioned authority. It revealed how easily systematic cruelty could flourish when communities chose ignorance over investigation, when officials prioritized convenience over justice, and when society's most vulnerable members existed beyond the reach of protective institutions. The photograph that Henry Peaton had risked his life to preserve now hangs in the West Virginia State Archives, serving as a permanent reminder of both human evil and human courage. Those 17 faces frozen in time and Silver Halley continue to bear witness to crimes that many would prefer to forget, ensuring that their suffering was not meaningless and their stories will not be lost to history. In the end, the Bone Creek Hollow case stands as one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but also as proof that even the most carefully constructed systems of oppression can be brought down by individual acts of courage and the persistent pursuit of truth. The children in that photograph waited over 50 years for justice, but their patience was finally rewarded by a photographer who refused to look away, a boy who risked everything to expose the truth, and a society that eventually found the courage to confront its own failures. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors often hide behind facades of respectability, protected not by supernatural forces, but by very human failings of courage, compassion, and integrity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such systematic cruelty could remain hidden for so long in isolated communities? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.